In this video, I'm going to be talking about a fun little fight I cooked up between the who would win between the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure major antagonists in the JJK universe. So I've recently been on a JoJo kick, and I've been really enjoying, you know, just rereading some of the parts. And I kind of thought it would be fun to discuss a fight that would involve all of them. And I tried to pick a universe that I thought would stand a chance and could also lead to some like interesting scenarios that are worth talking about. And the main one I rolled on was JJK. In terms of scaling, around similar, maybe a little lower on most ends, but maybe a little higher on the power end. And both universes have very technical and complex power systems, which kind of lead to very fun interactions when they're discussing. So for this, I kind of want to use some basic verse equalization. Basically, I want cursed energy and stand powers to be about equivalent. So stand users will be able to see cursed energy and cursed spirits, and of course, sorcerers will be able to see stands as well. Of course, this will lead to a few notable exceptions. Obviously, Cars doesn't have a stand, and Maki and Toji both don't have cursed energy. However, this won't really be super relevant. Cars, the ultimate life form, has a lot of talent when it comes to detecting, I guess, just things. It's very vague, of course, but he's very in tune with nature, the world, very sensitive to air and heat differences. There would be a very it would be very reasonable to assume that he wouldn't really have a hard time detecting cursed spirits. And even if he couldn't detect cursed spirits in any sense of form, not even in the same way that like Toji does by just having his heightened senses, there aren't a lot of cursed spirits that can really even do anything to him. So it's hard to really say that Cars would be a non-factor just because of that. And then Toji and Maki, obviously, they won't be able to see stands, but we'll give them their same ability to basically detect them, similar to how they can detect curse energy since we're using equalization. And this also kind of keeps it more fair and more interesting. So we're not really going to go over every single JJK character because there are far too many of them with their own unique powers. So instead, I plan to focus on a very specific list. I'll probably have to. So for the most part, the list is going to consist of just a few characters, but it is still important to know like the general scalings of the characters and how they relate to each other's universes. So I guess first of all, it's worth considering that these verses have relatively similar scaling. I'd say the general consensus for JoJo's is that the power scaling usually comes to around small building to like wall level. Even for the higher tiers, there's not really any demonstrations or anything greater than that. And in terms of speed, we get light speeds pretty early on in part two and with Hanging Man in part three. So very easy to get some of the higher tier characters, which all of the major antagonists are, to like those faster than light speeds. For JJK, the power level is generally agreed upon to be like small building to up to city level for some of the high tiers. Though the difference is the high tiers in JJK are definitely like way higher than some of the mid tiers. So like only really Gojo and Sukuna and maybe like Yuki are going to be getting to those like city levels of power. And same kind of with the speed. At the high end, we can probably calculate it to be around faster than light as well. But for a lot of the mid tier to lower characters, speed of sound is considered impressive. And of course, that would leave them kind of getting speed blitzed by most of JoJo's. So important to keep that in mind. But of course, there's going to be a lot of disagreement about scaling and what exactly is fair because, there's a wide variety. But this video, I'm not really super interested in going into, scaling and trying to determine who would win that way. I'm more so going to be looking at like hacks and how the hacks interact because these are two verses where the scaling is of course always going to be important, but for the most part it's the hacks that really drive both series and make the fights more interesting. So we're going to start off, I guess, with the JoJo villains and go through each of them and kind of explain their powers. Now, of course, the JoJo villains are incredibly complex and they have a very bizarre power set as well. So instead of sitting here and trying to explain three different types of time travel very intricately, I'm just going to try to give like a very concise explanation of each character and their powers and hope that we can really arrive in an answer from that. So we're going to start with part 3, Dio. We'll be using the version of him after he's absorbed a little bit of Joestar blood. So his time stop ability Of course, his ability to freeze time and move freely around in it will be extended to 9 seconds. So his main claim to fame, of course, is that time stop ability. He can pause time, and in stop time, he's the only one who can move around. In terms of speed and strength, he of course scales to Jotaro, who's easily able to catch a bullet at the beginning of part 3, and will eventually, scale to faster than light through Hanging Man and similar stands. He's easily able to punch through people. He's able to pick up like a road roller. Not really like as high end as the destruction feats of JJK, but in terms of like, the durability, like most JJK characters are going to get killed if they get hit by Dio. Next up is going to be Ultimate Cars. Now, Ultimate Cars is like a simultaneously very simple and complex character. He sometimes gets overhyped and sometimes gets undersold. There's a lot to him, but basically what it comes down to is he has super strength, super regeneration, and the ability to kind of adapt his DNA to form and replicate any animal in the animal kingdom. In terms of his IQ, he's considered to be like maybe the smartest character in the Jojo universe, which is saying a lot because pretty much every character with a stand in the Jojo universe is, already like a genius level IQ. You can see it in their fights and interactions. In terms of, feats for Ultimate Cars, he's able to survive volcano explosions, and really the only way he was ever able to be defeated was when he was just launched into space and then froze over. Even then, he didn't die. He was just unable to move and couldn't really return to Earth. So next up, we're going to talk about Kira. And of course, Kira has a bunch of different stands and abilities. We're not going to count his stray cat stand because that's not really a part of him. It was kind of just like, it had like a little compartment in Killer Queen. But even still, he has 3 stands, although only 2 of which are really super relevant for this fight. Killer Queen, of course, is his like most famous stand ability. Basically, anything it touches can become a bomb, and then he can manually detonate it, and it'll be destroyed on like an atomic level with an explosion. His next is Sheer Heart Attack. Sheer Heart Attack is like an autonomous stand, one of only 2 autonomous stands that are in this list, and its ability is that it can go up to somebody and basically just blow up. It tracks people based on heat, and it's like entirely indestructible, making it like actually a very difficult stand for people to deal with. And of course, we have Bites the Dust, which is his 3rd stand ability, which was acquired at the end of part 4. And Bites the Dust is very simple. Oh, excuse me, not very simple. The opposite, incredibly difficult to explain. But basically, what it comes down to is he can assign a non-stand user, I guess in this case like a non-cursed user, this stand, and it will like sit in them. And if that person ever discloses Kira's identity as like the killer, then he will the stand will detonate, and it will like send them back in time to the beginning of the day. Basically, it's like a weird like Groundhog Day machine, but for the most part, it's not really going to be relevant for the fight. The only situation you can even imagine it coming in is like if Kira decided to go up to Cars and like implant it in him, and then told Cars to go around telling people that he's Kira just so they can get a reset. There's really no point to it other than I guess Cars would remember everything that happened from the day before, so he would be able to disclose information. But honestly, it's a weird application. I don't think it's really worth talking about, so we'll probably mostly focus on Killer Queen and Sheer Heart Attack. Now we have King Crimson and Diavolo as the next JoJo's antagonists. So King Crimson's stand ability is not too dissimilar to Dio's, but it's also, completely different. So it really comes in 2 parts. One is Epitaph, which allows him to see a few seconds into the future, and it pairs very nicely with his other ability, which allows him to essentially erase time. So the way it's explained is that he can get to an end state or an end result without ever having to experience the cause. So like in this panel, bullets are able to travel without actually traveling their trajectory and just end up, hitting the target instead. And that's kind of just how his ability works. It's not too complicated, but it has weird applications, and we will probably discuss a little later. The next is going to be Poochie with his stand Made in Heaven. And this is where stands start to get like really busted. It's part 6 and onward. So Made in Heaven accelerates time. We're not going to factor in the universe reset because it doesn't really have any combative applications, at least so far as I can think. But in terms of what it does, it basically gives Pucci like super speed, and like speed to the point where he's able to like blitz someone like Jotaro, who's already massively faster than light. So in terms of speed, like Pucci's going to be the fastest person in the battlefield here. And then of course the world also continues to move at like high speeds around him, but that doesn't really have super big applications, so we won't worry about it. Next up, we have Funny Valentine. In his stand, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, abbreviated D4C in the community because Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap is a very big mouthful. So Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap has like a very strange ability to explain. It basically allows Funny Valentine to open pocket dimensions, which let him go in, grab alternate versions of himself or other people, and bring them to his reality. The only condition that needs to be active for this to activate is for Funny Valentine to be positioned between two things, like the American flag and the floor is one example of when he uses it. And in terms of fight applications, if he ever grabs an alternate version of somebody and they touch each other, they'll be like violently combined and killed that way. And also, Funny Valentine's able to basically mitigate damage that he takes that's non-lethal because he can just swap out with an alternate version of himself and pass on D4C. But what really makes Funny Valentine overpowered is his stand ability that he acquires after he interacts with the corpse. And this is Love Train. So Love Train's ability is a little strange, but to explain it, he basically has like a maze of walls around him that are made of light. And any attack that goes through them or like tries to pass through them that would harm Funny Valentine are instead redirected to like somebody else in the world. And that's really all there is to it. I guess the only way it was able to be defeated and the only like conventional attack that we know was able to go through it was Joestar's his infinite spin attack, which something about the infinity allowed it to bypass Love Train, hit Funny Valentine, and then he wasn't able to recover from it because the infinite rotation just kept doing infinite damage to him basically. And now of course the strongest, or I guess arguably strongest stand in Jojo's is going to be Wonder of You, and this stand probably presents the biggest problem for the JJK verse. Its powers are very complicated, but also very simple. The real complicated aspect comes in like the ambiguity and how little we've seen of it, in that we're not able to perfectly interpret what exactly entails its ability activation. But essentially, if anybody is found to have the intention to pursue Wonder of You, whether that's like physically trying to attack him or even like in a non-physical way, like the reporter who tried to expose him, then his stand ability activates, which is essentially just calamity. It's basically just being very unlucky, although it's a little more tied to the universe than that. It's very conceptual and hard to explain, but essentially if you try to attack Wonder of You or try to pursue him in any way, a very unfortunate set of events is going to happen to you that's going to injure you along the way and prevent you from reaching your goal. So, for example, a leaf falling can stop you by slicing your finger off, and that's an example that happens in the actual series. So, it's important to establish that pursuit, again, does not necessarily mean intent to kill. It can be anything as long as it's deemed pursuit. And we're going to get into exactly what that means a little later in some of the more specific explanations. But Wonder of You, of course, presents like a very big problem for the JJK universe. Really, there's only a few ways we're going to be able to imagine the JJK universe being able to get through Wonder of You's abilities, but we'll get into that detail after we explain the JJK. So that just about summarizes the JoJo's villains. We're going to go into some more specifics as we're discussing the battle, but that should give like a very brief rundown of their abilities and what they do. As for the JJK characters, as I said before, we're not going to focus on every single one because there's so many of them. Instead, I kind of picked out the list of the ones that I thought were going to be the most relevant for the fight. And really, anybody who isn't on this list doesn't really count because, for the most part, if these guys can't do it, then the rest of the universe is kind of cooked, if that makes sense. So this list is going to be Gojo, Sukuna, Yuta, Kenjaku, Yuji, Hikari, Yuki, Yorozu, Maki, Toji, Mahito, and Higuruma. So to get into it, I guess we'll start with Gojo. Gojo has a few really important abilities. One is, of course, his Lapse Blue, which is essentially a sphere of gravitational energy or something like that that absorbs people and draws them towards it. Anything that touches it is instantly crushed in its mass. And then he has Reversal Red as well. Reversal Red is a force that kind of does the opposite. Instead of pulling things, it pushes them away violently. And of course, when he combines his Reversal Red and Lapse Blue, he creates his Hollow Purple, which is basically a force of infinitely destructive, power that can rip things on like an atomic level. He shoots this, and anything it touches is basically instantly vaporized. It's a very difficult attack to deal with, especially if you're taking it head on. Most people really just can't. And aside from that, Gojo also, of course, has his domain expansion, Infinite Void, which basically just makes anybody caught in his domain process an infinite amount of information at once. And, of course, most people really can't handle that. And aside from that, he's also able to wrap his infinity around himself, in a sense. And the way this ability is explained is like the myth of Achilles and the hair, where the distance that you need to travel to actually reach Gojo is always infinitely divided, and thus anything that's traveling towards him can't really hit him. It's a very brief explanation. If you want more detail, there's plenty of people who've covered it online, but that's really all we're really going to know, is that attacks that need to travel to him typically won't. Next up, we have Sukuna, and of course, so for this, we're going to be using the Megumi version of Sukuna that we saw fight Gojo. I think that this is probably going to be the easiest to use because we have the most feats for him. The 19-finger Sukuna we see after doesn't really work because we don't really know exactly what his feats are. He's pretty heavily suppressed. So it's much easier to use Megumi Sukuna, and this will also, of course, give him access to Maharaga, which will be worth discussing. In terms of abilities, of course, his main thing is his domain and his domain ability, which allows him to slice, cleave, and cut. And basically, it does at some level ignore conventional durability, although not healing. And it's able to cover a very wide range that he's able to use it on. In terms of scaling, a lot of his feats go close to Gojo, which is around city, faster than light levels. And aside from that, he also has his fire arrow, which has some pretty high levels of heat and destructive power, and might be worth exploring in some of the matchups. But that pretty much summarizes Sukuna. Next up, we have Yuta. Yuta's abilities are going to be kind of easy to explain, and the real reason he's relevant for this fight is his copy ability, allowing him to copy the ability of anybody else. Of course, he doesn't necessarily always use it quite to the extent that the other person can, which we see when he copies Gojo's ability. He's not able to use Infinity to the same level that Gojo is, and part of that is because he doesn't have the 6 eyes, but he's just not quite on par with the characters that he takes the ability from in terms of using it, but he still has a lot of versatility, and he's also, among the top of the verse, so he's definitely worth bringing up in this discussion. Next up, we have Kenjaku. Kenjaku has one of the more versatile kits, although we don't really ever get to see it fully in use. He has the ability from Geto's body to summon cursed spirits, and of course, this has a lot of applications, but we've only really seen the smallpox demon. That's the most relevant one. And aside from that, Kenjaku, we also know, has the ability to essentially control gravity in a small area around him. We've only really seen him use this once, but gravity manipulation can be a pretty interesting thing to discuss, especially when we're talking about characters whose powers are very time based and such. But we'll have to get into that later as well when we're exploring actual interactions between characters. Next we have Itadori. Not really too much to talk about with Itadori. We don't really know exactly what his domain and such do. He's really just a strong, a decently strong boxer. Feels like it would be a little wrong to not include him in this list, but honestly, he doesn't really compare to some of the other characters in terms of their abilities, their hacks, and their ability to really interact with the Jojo characters. Because honestly, even if you have Superman level strength and speed, there's a lot of problems that you would run into fighting a lot of the Jojo villains because of how gimmicky some of their power sets are. Next up, we have Hikari, and of course, Hikari's abilities would require maybe 40 minutes to actually explain thoroughly. So I'll just give it as a basic, he can activate his domain, Within his domain, if he hits a jackpot, he gets infinite stats, like basically infinite regeneration, and his speed and strength are greatly increased. And the longer he is in a fight, the higher his chance of hitting a jackpot. And even after he hits a jackpot, he can keep hitting consecutive jackpots depending on his luck. He's, again, kind of like Itadori, where he's like a physical powerhouse, but against a lot of the Jojo villains, that doesn't really pan out too well. Now we have, for the next one, Yuki. And Yuki's main claim to fame is going to be her black hole attack, which, is stated to have the destructive power to like engulf the entire planet. Without Tengen's barrier, it probably would have, at least based on what the author writes. But in terms of destructive power, obviously this is probably among, if not the strongest attack in the JJK universe, like maybe second to Gojo's Hollow Purple in terms of like pure destructive ability. Obviously, for the most part, any character caught in a black hole, if they don't have a way to escape, is going to die. So, that's why she's very relevant for any discussion, in my opinion, with versus battles. Next, we have Yorozu. Yorozu's main ability, and you can see a lot of the characters really have one ability that kind of makes them the most relevant when it comes to this fight, because it's their claim to fame or it's their super hacks ability, and that's kind of what you need to beat Jojo's. So Yorozu has the perfect sphere, which is basically, as it says, a perfect sphere which has infinite points. And the logic behind how it works is, it can absorb attacks, but also if it makes contact, it has infinite destructive ability, because the way it's explained is the force that's applied depends on the amount of like contact area, and because there's infinitely many points on a sphere, any contact would be infinite contact, and thus like it would be infinite force, so high destructive ability. Obviously, there's some parts of this that don't really make sense, like the idea that if you're applying force over an infinite area, then like the pressure is going to be infinitesimally small, but it's not really like worth going into that. We'll take it as it is because it is kind of how it shows in the verse, so we'll take it as is. Now, in terms of Maki and Toji, again, these guys are physical powerhouses, maybe among the fastest and strongest in the verse, but without the hacks, they don't really have a super easy way to beat the Jojo villains. But I guess in the case of Toji, we can give him his sword that nullifies curse techniques, and with verse equalization, I guess this would also count as nullifying stand abilities. Although, this wouldn't be able to stop like Dio's time stop or anything. It's basically only going to be able to stop something it can cut through, like maybe Love Train's effect, or maybe even Wonder of You. Although it's hard to imagine that Wonder of You's ability could be stopped, considering it's more of a force of nature as opposed to like a direct stand ability. But people can interpret that as they will with their own like headcanon. But I don't think that I would consider it as a possible way to defeat Wonder of You. And then, of course, next up we have Mahito. Mahito is really only super relevant for this discussion for a few reasons. One, like insane regeneration, right? Like unreal levels, like really in the verse, he can only be killed if he's damaged like at his soul. And, since JoJo's doesn't really have soul manipulation, you might think like he might be unkillable. But of course, when it comes to characters with like insane regeneration, I think the general rule is if they can be like completely atomized, there's just nothing for them to be regenerated from. So, if any of the characters from JoJo's, and spoiler, there are characters from JoJo's that can like atomize him, then that's like a win condition. Also worth noting, he has his domain expansion, which is pretty much like an instant kill if he is able to connect it with any of the JoJo's characters. And lastly, we have Higuruma. Stat-wise, probably the biggest mismatch here. But his domain is very unique and might have some applications in terms of making the fight go a little more in the JJK favor. Basically, he'll trap them in the domain. It'll be a court case, and it'll try the, I guess, person he catches with any like one specific crime that they committed anytime in their life. And they have a chance to defend themselves. If they're found guilty by Higuruma's little judge thing, then they'll lose their curse techniques, in cursed energy. In this case, I think the JoJo's characters would lose their stand abilities, I guess with the exception of Kars, because he doesn't really have a stand ability, so, he doesn't count for it. But the rest of them would. So with that out of the way, and that was a lot, we've gotten through like most of the basic character abilities. So I'll talk about the fun part, which is specific character interactions. So to go about this, I think I'm gonna just list out some of the like heavy hitters first from like JoJo's, and talk about like possible ways JJK characters would be able to interact with them. And then work my way down the list, and eventually we'll probably get to an answer because we'll explore most of the matchups. So first off is going to be Wonder Review. I think, in my opinion, Wonder Review probably poses the biggest threat to the JJK universe because his powers are very difficult to overcome. The way he was able to be defeated in JoJo's was by essentially getting hit by an attack that defied logic and thus didn't trigger Calamity, which is like a very logical power as it's described. So in terms of if any JJK character is going to have like a logic defying attack, I think that in this discussion, very possible that both Yorozu and Gojo would come up pretty frequently. So Gojo, for one, has his hollow purple, which is in some sense infinite, like in its destructive ability, not unlike how Josuke's bubble was infinite in the way that it expanded, which allowed it to define logic. But both with Gojo and Yorozu, their abilities are very grounded in logic, and you can tell by the way the JJK writer writes, like everything makes like I guess like is consistent with at least the physics of the JJK universe. So they're not abilities that surpass logic, and thus I wouldn't say that they should be able to surpass Wonder Review's Calamity. And so some may disagree with that, but that's kind of how I interpret it. And then in terms of like domain expansions, some might say like all Gojo would have to do is catch Wonder Review in a domain expansion, but unfortunately that's not the case because as we see throughout the series, Wonder Review is able to stop attacks from connecting with him. He had a gun pointed at him like point blank, and he was still able to avoid it using the power of Calamity. So if anybody would do something that would put his life in like grave immediate danger, the power of Calamity will stop them. And you may think like Gojo has his infinity that surrounds him. Most attacks wouldn't really be able to reach him. And while that is true, Calamity doesn't really care about that. It can really be anything that's a weapon. It can even be like a piece of clothing that Gojo is wearing, like a hair or an eyelash that falls off of him and then becomes sharp enough to just cut him, or even like internal organ failure. There's just not enough ways for Gojo to protect against like every possible calamity, at least in the way I interpret it. So that kind of means that Gojo doesn't have a crazy good chance. And of course, Higuruma can't use his domain for the same reason. It still constitutes a pursuit. Again, like pursuit doesn't have to be like a physical attack. It can be anything that counts as pursuing. And in this case, if you're trying to get somebody, I guess like in some sense arrested, or like trying to take something away, that is like in a sense a pursuit. And then in terms of Mahito and Maharaga, they may come up because they have like super high regeneration, but it's Wonder Review does ignore conventional durability, and I guess even though Mahito and Maharaga may be able to like adapt or may be able to regenerate from any ability that Wonder Review or any like calamity that Wonder Review is able to inflict on them, there isn't a lot they can really do to hurt him. There may be an argument for Maharaga. He would definitely have a chance with his adaptation, which basically allows him to adapt to anything, including abstract concepts, which we see when he adapts to Gojo's infinity. In terms of how long it would take Maharaga to adapt, I don't know if you'd be able to adapt before Wonder Review kills him. Even though Maharaga has pretty impressive resistance and durability, I think Wonder Review first of all ignores that durability, and second of all, based on how intense the pursuit on Wonder Review is, the higher the like damage output he gives back. So if Maharaga is really trying with everything to like kill Wonder Review, there's a good chance that Wonder Review's calamity will hit him with like a lethal amount of damage that he won't be able to get back up from. And not only that, but Wonder Review is also capable of redirecting other attacks in a way. So he can make Gojo misfire his hollow purple, which would absolutely destroy Maharaga if it like fully connected, right? And like things like that. Sukuna kind of for the same reason that Gojo and the others can't really touch Wonder Review. If he's like, actively trying to fight Wonder Review, he's just not going to be able to do it. Domain expansion won't cut it either. But that being said, I think there are two plausible ways that Wonder Review could be defeated by the JJK crew. Both of them feel like they may be unlikely, but they're definitely not impossible. So the first would be through Love Train. So as I said before, Love Train's ability is that it will redirect misfortune to anybody else in the world. So, if we're assuming this fight takes place like, maybe the Jojo villains were just dropped into the JJK universe, and for whatever reason, the JJK universe characters were all like down to work together to fight them off, right? So in this case, say Gojo fires his hollow purple at Funny Valentine. Funny Valentine's love train will absorb that misfortune and send it and redirect it to somebody else. And if it happens to redirect to Toru or Wonder Review, then that would probably be enough to kill them, right? Because there's no intention for Love Train's effect to target them. It would just happen to be them, and that's, in my opinion, wouldn't constitute a pursuit if it's just by like a complete accident, complete numbers. But of course, in the JJK universe, presumably 8 billion people, the chances of that happening are going to be pretty low. There's going to be a lot of like slugging, and I don't think the JJK universe has like the survivability to just like keep shooting hollow purples at Funny Valentine until that happens. I think that more than likely Wonder Review would probably get the win before that can happen. And so the other way that Wonder Review can like feasibly get defeated would be if he's hit by accident. And again, it's really weird, and it doesn't really get brought up much in Wonder Review debates. But I guess that's because most Wonder Review fights are like one-on-one. So I guess what I mean is, if Gojo is fighting, say, like Dio, shoots a hollow purple, Dio uses time skip and dodges it, and it just happens to be in trajectory to hit Wonder Review. Gojo didn't have any intention to pursue Wonder Review or Toru, therefore he wouldn't activate Calamity, and if that attack connects, and I can't really see a reason why it shouldn't, then that would be a feasible way Wonder Review could probably get killed. And so there's a lot of difficulty in like discussing exactly how the JJK characters can exploit this. First of all, I do think that the JJK characters are probably smart enough to figure out pretty quickly how Calamity works. And then if they're not actively pursuing Wonder Review, then there's not really anything Wonder Review can actively do to them. But, since this is like a fight, presumably to the death, that's not going to be a satisfactory answer. But basically what that means is they can kind of ignore Wonder Review up until the end. Or alternatively, in the middle of the chaos in the fight, if one of the JJK characters is somehow able to bait Wonder Review into, walking into another attack, then, that might be a possible avenue. For example, if Sukuna just opens his domain and slashes everything in it, then that could hit Wonder Review while not specifically pursuing him, and thus not activate the calamities. So, and also, in JoJo's, we've seen that Wonder Review is able to be, baited. As long as you're not actively pursuing him, you can take steps to make him, walk after you. And that might be a way that, one of the clever characters might be able to get Wonder Review in range of one of those attacks that can, kill him. But the problem is there's no real easy way to bait Wonder Review into going the direction you want him to. In JoJo's, there was a very specific, Wonder Review wanted to get to the fruit. And Jojo is kind of putting himself between Wonder Review and the fruit, and thus Wonder Review had to approach him. But in terms of this fight, there's no real easy way to make Wonder Review walk after something, but it is still worth exploring as a possible avenue, because really those are the only two ways I could ever see Wonder Review losing to the JJK universe. So next we have Funny Valentine, and Funny Valentine has, his stand ability Love Train, which is probably the most relevant for this fight. In terms of ways around it, conventional attacks aren't really going to cut it. As I said before, I don't think that Infinity in JJK really counts as the same Infinity as, the JoJo's universe. Since, I guess in the JoJo's universe, Infinity feels like a little more illogical. But, maybe you can make an argument that something like Yorozu's Infinite Sphere would be able to bypass Love Train. And, I could see that as a very valid argument. But there's probably an easier way for Funny Valentine to be defeated, and I would say that's probably just to hit him with a domain expansion. Specifically, a domain expansion that doesn't cause physical harm, because we've only seen Love Train redirect physical damage. I bet, if Gojo catches him in range, and, it's not like a domain expansion travels. So, there's no reason Love Train would really be able to intercept it. But if, Gojo is able to hit Funny Valentine with a domain expansion, and, therefore, Funny Valentine can't redirect it, and then just floods Funny Valentine's brain with infinite information, that's kind of a KO. Like, Funny Valentine's just cooked. If Funny Valentine tries to use Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap to swap out with an alternate version, it probably still wouldn't help, because that alternate version will probably also be caught in the domain expansion, and then that infinite information would still just fry their brain. So, Made in Heaven was a stand that I didn't originally think was really going to be that relevant for this fight, because the whole main showing of it is the universe reset, which doesn't really have combat applications. But there is something pretty important to note, and that's that Pucci is way faster than every other character here. Even with the generous scaling for JJK, I would say that it's only maybe about equal with some of the other villains of the JoJo's universe, but Pucci is just way faster. He's able to speed blitz characters like Jotaro, who are around Dio's level, with very little to no difficulty whatsoever. So in terms of ways that he can be stopped, if he decides he wants to hit someone, he probably will, with the exception, of course, of Gojo. Gojo's Infinity would probably protect him from any attack that travels normally. So in terms of ways to beat Gojo, I don't really see Pucci having an out. And then all it takes is 1 second for Gojo to hit a domain expansion, and Pucci is again cooked. I also wanted to talk about, I guess, Yuki, because she may have some applications with especially her mass control, because mass and speed are very fundamentally connected. But that's a physics route, and I don't really think I'm qualified to even explore what the application of something like that could be. But then we have Sukuna and Maharaga. So Sukuna, again, if he catches him in a domain, it's pretty much game over. But in terms of speed, I just think Pucci is just gonna absolutely run him right away. And to be fair, Sukuna and Gojo have incredible regeneration abilities, but if they get their head kicked off or something, there's just nothing they can do. They're dead. Maharaga, it's hard to exactly identify how Maharaga's adaptation would interact with Made in Heaven, because Made in Heaven essentially controls a fundamental aspect of the universe, and it's hard to say if Maharaga would adapt to that, because it's not like Maharaga adapted to gravity and is now able to resist it. And to be fair, Made in Heaven is basically a gravity power. It evolved from Pucci's ability to literally control gravity. So in that sense, Maharaga might not be able to adapt, but there may also be some way you could spin it where Maharaga is able to eventually adapt to Pucci's speed before Pucci is able to do lethal damage. But I kind of don't think that's possible. I think Pucci would probably be able to kill Maharaga before that happened. So I guess another JoJo villain to explore would be Ultimate Cars. For the most part, most JoJo's characters cannot, or JJK characters cannot step up to Ultimate Cars. His regeneration is way too hard to deal with. His IQ is also through the roof. He's not getting outsmarted anytime soon. But unfortunately for Cars, JJK has many characters with infinitely destructive abilities, and the ability to atomize him basically. Of course, if he gets hit by a hollow purple, if he gets hit by the black hole from Yuki, or Yorozu's infinite sphere, he's done. Infinite damage, as long as it can atomize him, he just can't regenerate from it. Even based on the scaling that we've seen in the feats, there's just no reason to believe he would be able to. And of course, even though he has a 400 IQ, if Gojo hits him with his domain expansion, then he's cooked. Although the main argument would be that Cars, based on the way that I've described this battle scenario, is probably immune to domain expansions, right? And I think that's fair, because he doesn't have a stand, and thus he won't have cursed energy in this equalized fight. So if he can't get hit by a domain expansion, then I see this going kind of badly for the JJK verse. In terms of speed, only their top tiers are really going to step up to Cars, and if it's just Gojo who's able to even keep pace with Cars, he's probably not going to have a very easy time hitting him with the hollow purple. In the event where it's just Gojo versus just Cars, I think that Gojo might be able to pull a victory. He's showed very like creative applications of Lapse Blue and Reversal Red, and it might be plausible that he would be able to catch Cars in like a not dissimilar way to how he caught Maharaga. But with the other JoJo's villains, it feels like Gojo has to pull a lot of weight, and I really don't see him, having an easy time fighting Cars by any means. Now, in terms of threats that the JJK universe has to JoJo's, the main one that comes up is Higuruma. If he catches any of Dio, Pucci, Valentine, Akira, or Diavolo in his domain, very good chance he can just take away their powers. Again, it kind of can also come up a bit to RNG. And of course, the JoJo villains are incredibly smart. But, if he pulls them into his domain and it's like, some irrefutable crime, like, Kira killing somebody and taking their hand, there's not really much that Kira is going to be able to really do to dissuade the judge from ruling in Higuruma's favor. And thus, he would lose his state ability. In terms of problems for the JoJo's universe as well, I think Gojo stands out as one, but really he's not a problem. We've already discussed how he would interact with Wonder of You and Funny Valentine. And so, probably wins against Funny Valentine, maybe has a tough time with Wonder of You, but like not impossible that the JJK universe could deal with him, especially because, they can choose to ignore him for the majority of the fight and then kind of work on him later. But Diavolo and Dio bring up interesting points when it comes to like how exactly Gojo's Infinity works. It comes down to how you interpret it as well. So if you think that Gojo's Infinity is going to work and stop or erase time, then, there's really nothing Dio and Diavolo can do to stop him. But I think more likely than not, there's no real indication that Gojo's Infinity can stop time manipulation and like work through it. So I would assume that, all it would take is Dio walking in range, stopping time, and then he can just throw a fist through Gojo's chest and kill him instantly. But I guess the main precedent I have for thinking that is there's no interaction Gojo has with any time manipulation, so there's really no way for us to gauge it. And there's no like indication that time's like stopped or anything within his domain or within his infinity as well. So it's really hard to make an argument that it should be able to stop it. And especially with like something like Diavolo's power, where Diavolo's able to erase the cause and just skip straight to the effect. So if he gets in range, he can erase the time that it would take for him to punch Gojo, I guess, right in the face. And then just instead skip to the event of him hitting Gojo. And, I think with some of their destructive ability, like a lot of these characters might be able to just kill Gojo straight up like that. Although, might be worth exploring, Gojo is maybe a little, like, stronger in terms of, like, scaling. Being, like, closer to city level than the wall level that most JoJo's characters show in terms of raw strength. So that might be a point to explore where maybe, like, Diavolo and Dio don't even have the physical strength to deal enough damage to him, especially considering like he can use his reverse curse technique to heal like back most of the damage he takes. So really this also comes down to interpretation, but the way I see it is the JJK universe versus JoJo villains kind of just comes down to Gojo versus the JoJo villains. And while he may have like a decent matchup against a few of them, all of them at once leads me to think that there's a very good chance that he can't really pull the win off. Two more characters that are worth exploring are going to be Maharaga and Mahito, and I just want to get this out of the way. Insane regeneration, of course, but as I mentioned before, regeneration can be stopped by complete atomization and like making it so that nothing exists remaining, or if they're sent into space or something. So Wonder of You, of course, ignores conventional durability. Not impossible to think that he could like redirect an attack from Gojo to connect with these two and just kill them instantly. And then, of course, Kira, who we actually haven't really explored much in this fight because honestly he's probably the weakest of the JoJo villain. But, his speed gets him to those levels that he needs to be. And if he's able to tag either of them with Killer Queen, he'd probably be able to kill them pretty easily because Killer Queen is stated to be able to destroy on like a cellular level. So I guess with all of that out of the way, the question is just then, who would probably win. And now I think there's a lot of debate that can be had here, and it really comes down to how you want to interpret it, and really, I guess in some sense, who you want to win, right? Can Gojo stop Wonder Review's calamities? Can Wonder Review's calamities stop Gojo's domain expansion? How does Kara's figure into it? And there's just a lot that can be explored, and a lot of ways that you can spin it going one way or the other. But for my personal opinion, it really does also come down to how Gojo can interact with time, and how you want to interpret that. But in my opinion, I think the JoJo's characters are probably just a little too much to deal with. If it was any one villain, with maybe exception of Wonder Review, I could see the JJK verse pulling a victory very plausibly. But I think just having Wonder Review with the addition of all the other threats makes it incredibly difficult. Maybe having a team fight setting makes it a little easier on the JJK characters, where Wonder Review is maybe a little more easy to kill, just hoping that he gets hit by accident. But if your character is so strong that the only feasible way he can be defeated is by accidentally stepping into some attack that can kill him, then maybe there's no real reliable way you can kill him, and you can't really say that the verse has too easy of a chance. So personally, I'd give it to the JoJo villains, but I think that this debate has a lot of room for interpretation. It could really go either way, and I honestly was just making this video for fun. I really enjoyed making it, really enjoyed talking about it, and maybe I'll make more videos like this in the future.